Hello, and welcome to Hillbilly Cat History, where today we're joining our fictional Elvis fan Joyce in Memphis on August 18th, 1977, as she tries to solve the mystery of August 16th, 1977. Joyce is at her house. She's with a lot of her friends. They're going to try to see the procession of the funeral today, all the limos and the hearse as it goes towards the gravesite. Hi, Marion. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate seeing you here. But before they head out into the hot July day or August day, they're still trying to get through some newspapers from the day before that some of Joyce's Elvis friends have brought to her house. You know, they've all tried to pool their resources together, get as much evidence together as they can. But before we get to looking at those articles where we left off, we're going to take a look at another picture. Joyce's friends have again come through, and they found another piece of evidence. We don't know how, exactly how it connects to the mystery of August 16th yet. But let's take a look and see what they brought her. Hi, Terry. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. So on screen now, you should be able to see a picture of a shirt. And it's got two Native American heads on it and some blue designs and embroidery. This is a shirt, not a stage wear shirt, but a casual wear shirt of Elvis Presley's. And Elvis gave this shirt to Ginger Alden, possibly in 1976. It would have been very late in 1976, or sometime in 1977. Kind of a narrow window of when Ginger Alden receives all of her gifts, but this is one of them, and it is a real shirt that Elvis wore. It's a delicately hand-embroidered Native American shirt. It's dominated by the simple and riveting stitched figures of Indian chiefs in war paint in full headdress on the front. Two of them. There's one on each sleeve. And there is a massive design which takes up the entire back. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the back. We'll just have to kind of imagine what it looks like, but we can probably imagine a little bit from the front. Southwest-oriented rock and symbol designs appear throughout the shirt, which burst with snake-like slashes of beautiful bright colors like red, blue, black, gold, and brown. And it's trimmed around the collars, the sleeves, and the cuffs, and down the red snap front in red, blue, and turquoise. Tag at the rear on the neck says, from, quote, Susie Cream Cheese Loves You, Sunnyvale, Las Vegas, end quote. And Susie Cream Cheese was a store where people would buy custom clothes. It was a very famous store at the time. So there's no size indicated for this shirt, which means that it was most likely custom made for Elvis. It's a one of a kind, or at least they made this one specifically for Elvis, even if they later copied it. And there's also sweat stains on this shirt. And it's Elvis's sweat stains, because he actually wore this shirt before he gave it to Ginger. And Marion's saying she'd love to wear that shirt. Hi, Colleen. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. Hi, Sherry. Appreciate seeing you here too. And Sherry's saying that Elvis was a trailblazer for his amazing fashion sense, which would have been out of place which wouldn't have been out of place all these years later. What a brilliant man he was. I'd agree with that. I mean, this still is, I think somebody that would wear this shirt today probably still get a lot of attention, and it's still quite a fashion statement. It doesn't look dated at all to me, although it does deal with images that might be dated. Hi, little feather. Appreciate seeing you here. I believe this is the first time I've seen your name here in chat, so welcome to the show. At some auction in the past, and I don't know when the date of that auction was, this shirt sold for $8,112, which is about the same as the first signature that we saw the other day on a library card. About the same price. Kind of crazy, huh? All right, let's look at another piece that I have. All right, this is where we left off. We were in Los Angeles looking at the Herald Examiner, and they printed quite a few stories. And we'd basically gotten through the first one. And Terry's saying that Elvis wore a shirt similar to that one in Kissing Cousins in 1964. All right, so one of the stories deals with a specific day, and it's a day that, I'm going to read the story, and then I'm going to tell you what day it was, and it's the day that Elvis is wearing this coat. And you can see I've got a couple of pictures of him. One of them was with Vernon, and we were looking at it a few minutes ago. And here's one by himself where he's got a little bit of an odd expression on his face. It's a very interesting one. Like maybe he's eating something sour, or somebody just said something, he's not sitting well with him perhaps, or it's just one of those pictures of a person's face that gets snapped at a weird time, and he was just moving his face around. We don't really know. And Little Feather is saying, I would wear that shirt, representation of unity of nations. Thank you for that, Little Feather. Appreciate that comment. And Little Feather is saying, I think her name is Heather. Is that what you're saying? Your name is Heather, and happy to be here listening from Mackinac. Good to have you. So let me pull up my story here so I get it right for you guys. And so here's the story out of the Herald. While the shock of Elvis Presley's death spread through the people on the street and within the music industry, there was a special group of people whose dedication to the entertainer's life created entities separate yet transferable to the man in Southern California. The group is known as the Completely Elvis Fan Club. Now, to me, that sentence made no sense, but I think they're trying to introduce that in Southern California, in Los Angeles, there is a fan club. It's called the Completely Elvis Fan Club. At least there was in 1977. And Heather's saying that we are all in her algorithm and she's listening in a sacred space. Gratitude and blessings. Thank you, Heather. I appreciate that. And the president of this fan club was named Val Purett. And here's some quotes from her. It was just something he generated in everybody. The love, kindness, and generosity. Everyone wanted to do something and do it because of what Elvis has given them. I just loved him dearly. It's one of the biggest losses that we can all suffer. He was somebody we could all look up to as a person. He was a beautiful person. He was always someone everyone wanted to see. Elvis Presley was so much alive. He was somebody so very special. That's all I can say. Very special. God must have intended things to do with him right now, or he wouldn't have taken him. Purett said she'd always been aware of Presley's continuing medical problems, from the respiratory difficulties to his bouts with pneumonia. She said, I'd heard he had been ill, and as far as watching him from time to time, I can tell when he hasn't felt well. And he's gone up there, and he's done his show, regardless of how he felt, because of us. And if anything else, his fans are the ones that I feel hurt. He knew we wanted to see him, and he wasn't going to let us down. So he'd better be working himself that much more. You just can't work city to city every night and put on a fantastic show. You don't do that to please yourself. He did it to please us. So I thought that was a pretty good line there. You just can't work city to city every night and put on a fantastic show. You don't do that to please yourself. He did it to please us. And Marion's saying that she's listening from Germany. Thank you so much, Marion, for letting us know that. And Heather's saying that she's 52 years young, which I believe is an age that several of us in here are right around or at. So good to know, Heather. Thank you so much for letting us know that. According to my stats from YouTube, nobody younger than like 45 listens to any of these. Although I know there are a few that come that are younger, but YouTube believes everybody in here is over 45. Purett goes on, the president of this fan club, and she says, I was about 9 years old when I fell in love with him. She's now 29, as of the 1977 when she was interviewed for this article. And she followed his career her entire life, basically since the age of 9, for an entire generation. But it wasn't until May 8th, 1974, that Purett met the superstar in person. On Elvis Day in San Bernardino, which was May 8th, 1974, they issued a proclamation by the city forefathers, or the city fathers, and they selected Purett to present Elvis with a key to the city. So Purett went to one of his shows so that she could give him this key. And I believe that show, even though the article does not state which show that is, was May 11th in Los Angeles. And it's the show where Elvis was wearing this leather coat that day that you see in the picture. And he also said from stage that Led Zeppelin was in the audience. So like the band had made a mistake and he said, hey, we got to do this over again. Led Zeppelin's in the audience. Come on, guys, let's do this right. You know, something like that. That was this show. And she went there. Purett, the president of this Southern California Elvis fan club, she gave the key to the city of San Bernardino to Elvis, presented it to him, and she also handed over a check for $1,200, which was the sum that had been raised by the members of her fan club when they put on an Elvis Presley film festival to raise money for the Easter Seals, which was a charity. And it was one of Elvis's favorite charities. And Purett said, we just happened to pick this one because Elvis was very fond of children. And it happened to be one of his favorite charities. So Elvis, you know, just by being Elvis and having fans, raised $1,200 for charity. And he received it that night so that he could hand it on to the charity. And Heather saved forevermore in our hearts. and that she was born loving Elvis Aaron Presley. And Anna, hello Anna, thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. And Anna's saying that he is gorgeous in this picture with this long leather trench coat with the red stitching. And Heather's saying that she met Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin in Memphis, and that he laughed at her when she did not know who Led Zeppelin was. So you must have not known who Jimmy Page was at the time either. That's a good story. That's a real good story. I've done similar things to that, never with the Led Zeppelin, but I've met people that were famous and didn't know it too. So that's very interesting. And Marion's saying that Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin loved Elvis. Yeah, all of them guys loved Elvis. All of them early rock and rollers. They all grew up listening to Elvis, and they all copied themselves, patterned themselves after Elvis. And they saw that Elvis went and found his dreams, and they went and found their dreams too. And then Purett, the president of this fan club, who has 500 members, and they raised that $1,200. And many of her fan members or fan club members were from outside the country, so they weren't even there to help them. She says they try, quote, primarily to keep up with the new Elvis music and to help raise money for the Easter Seals through a walkathon, auctioning off albums, and they put out a yearbook every year. And then they asked if the club would continue to do its work for Elvis. And Purett said, absolutely. That's what it's all about. Love doesn't stop just because somebody leaves. It's something that's an ongoing thing. So love doesn't stop just because somebody leaves. It's something that's an ongoing thing. And that was the president of an Elvis fan club in Southern California. All right, let's take a look at some television stuff, if I can get it to work today. Last time I tried this, it did not want to cooperate. But let's see what happens today. Nothing. All right, hang on a second here. Oh, here we go. All right, this is people that are waiting, I believe, to get in on August 17th to see the body at Graceland. And that's why they're all lined up. Could be the following day, but I'm fairly certain it's the 17th. And Heather's saying that Elvis was also a veteran. That's true. And all the veterans for standing in... She's thanking all veterans for standing for our freedom and liberty. Yes, today, on Labor Day, really a day for workers in America, but also a good day to think about our veterans. We can see a guy on screen here. He's reading the newspaper, and he's just completely upset by what he's reading. And you get a kind of an idea, if you were there, what the size of this crowd would have looked like. Now, it's huge. You can't take the whole thing in.
Why have you come here today? We wanted to see Elvis for the last time as a final remembrance of him. He was just becoming popular when my wife and I were teenagers in high school. So we just wanted to stop and see him. We were in Nashville yesterday at the Hall of Fame Museum when we heard about his death. So we decided as we were traveling back home, we'd stop here at and see him in Memphis.
All right, thank you. See the nurse?
So that guy brought his whole family. He and his wife were so affected by the death of Elvis Presley that they brought the whole family to stand outside of Graceland. and were probably felt like they were lucky enough to be there at the point when people were lining up to get into the house, and then were, becoming part of that line.
Okay, here we go.
It's giving me some problems again. Let's see what our issue is.
What's your name?
My name is Rebecca Hayden. I'm from here in Memphis.
Rebecca, why is it?
Yeah, that's weird because it was playing fine there for a second, and then I get to a little bit into it. Let me try this again. Nope. Now we're bad from the very beginning. Let me try something else here. See if this will work.
Wife and I were teenagers in high school, so we just wanted to stop and see him.
Nope. All right, let me try one more time here. Yeah. All right. So for whatever reason, it will not allow me to play this right now. And I'm not sure exactly what the issue is. So we're going to skip this part for right now. I will figure this out eventually, and we will get to see this video, whether it wants us to or not. It's so odd because it's just something about, like, it plays it for a little while, and then something in the software doesn't like it for some reason. But I've got so much other stuff to look at. So let's take a look here. So in that newspaper we were looking at, they had this illustration of a guitar, and one of the strings has popped off, and it's turned itself into an Elvis with a little wavery note, as if the guitar itself is mourning Elvis. I just thought this was a neat little picture to look at. And then this is a picture of an ad that was in that paper, and it's of a little known movie that almost no one's ever heard of, called Star Wars. It was out there in its original run in the theaters in 1977 with Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher. Not really a part of Elvis history, but there's the ad. It had been running since May, and so this is August. And I think it was late May that it came out, but June, July, and a half months. So it had been running for about 2.5, almost 3 months. And so back in the day, if you had a hit movie, it would run for a long time in the theaters. I don't think that really happens now. I think it's like 2 weeks and out, no matter how much of a hit they are. Although I don't think they really have big, huge blockbusters anymore. Not like Star Wars was back in the day. But that's the other thing that's going on in the world at this moment when Elvis Presley has passed away. Now, these are 3 gentlemen that you probably don't know. Colleen's saying that she can't wait to go to Graceland. And that Anna's saying she loved that guitar picture. So the 3 guys in this picture well, it's going to take just a minute to get to them. Let me tell you a couple other things first. they interviewed some other fans in the newspaper. And then they interviewed some people which were more famous, like semi-celebrities to celebrities. And these three guys are part of the semi-celebrity group. But let's talk about the non-celebrities first before I get to them. And the newspaper reported that at an appearance in Hollywood, Florida, in February 1977. So if you're from outside the country, you may not know that there are two Hollywoods in America. One is in California. That's where they film all the movies and stuff that you're familiar with. That's the famous Hollywood. There is another Hollywood in Florida, all the way across the country and very far to the south. It's down south of Fort Lauderdale and north of Miami. So it's not quite as far south as you can go, but it's a little place on the beach, and it's called Hollywood, California. And there's a lot of entertainment that goes on there. So when you read stuff about old Hollywood, you often encounter Hollywood, Florida as well. So just one of those things that even if you're from this country, like I grew up in Indiana and I lived 20 years in Florida later. And until I moved to Florida, I never had any idea that this Hollywood, Florida was there, or that that was what was being referenced a lot of times when I would see the name Hollywood. And Ann is saying that for her, Elvis trumped Star Wars. But what if Elvis had gotten the role of Han Solo in Star Wars? Can you imagine how big a hit it would have been then? But back to this, the real world of Hollywood, Florida, in February 1977. One fan was asked, so that, you know, he's doing a show in Hollywood, and the press asked one of the fans that's there, they're making fun of Elvis for being fat, basically, and they say he's got some extra weight on him, and even fat and heavy, could Elvis still be sexy? Is what they asked this female fan. And she replies, it doesn't matter. He's Elvis. And they pulled that quote and put it into this article to remind people that this is how people felt about Elvis when he was alive. And then they interviewed a lady named Rosemary Daniel. And she was the administrator of the Ford Employers Council. So she had something to do with employee relations between Ford executives and Ford workers, the labor force. And she said, quote, I'm going to put a black border around his picture that I've kept on my bedroom wall since I was 18 years old. He was only 2 years older than I, and once I even stepped on his blue suede shoes. I was at the Long Beach Pike, and he was there incognito, but surrounded by several beautiful blondes and his bodyguards. As I got off the Ferris wheel, I accidentally stepped on someone's shoes, and it was Elvis's, and they were really blue suede. So Rosemary says she's loved Elvis ever since he became famous, and she once stepped on his blue suede shoes. And that's a heck of a fan story, right? Like, if you had that story, you would have told it to everybody, I'm sure. And then they interviewed a lady named Barbara Hughes. She was a legal secretary from Encino, which is a place in California, Encino, California. And she said, quote, it's the end of an era. We all grew up with him in the 50s. It was as if he were singing background accompaniment to our best years. We matured with him, and it's like one of us has died. It brings the feeling of death very close to me. So this is a woman who grew up with Elvis, and now he's passed away, and she sees her own mortality in his passing away. And then we've got a guy that they interviewed named Elaine Eric Giordon. and he's actually an executive with Lacombe Cosmetics out of Paris, France. And he said, quote, "It makes me feel that we're just passing through this life when someone so visible dies. Most of the French have always thought his movies were merely slick showcases for his singing, so we didn't like them very much. But we did all dance to Hound Dog when we were teenagers. Even if we didn't understand all the words, he was really a monument as far as the French were concerned." So this guy apparently speaking for the entire French nation of France, saying that they too mourn Elvis Presley. Although he says they didn't like his movies. And then Christine Mitchell Driver, who was the owner of Main Line, and Maine is M-A-N-E, like a lion's mane, Main Line, which was a hairdressing salon in London, England, says that she once met Elvis backstage in Las Vegas through her friend, comedian Marty Allen. She said, quote, "I met a living legend and felt very fortunate. It was like getting to the end of my rainbow. It's like a little piece of myself going. I've been an enormous fan since I was about 10. Well, more than just a fan, really. He's just incorporated himself into my lifestyle, influenced the decor in my home, the gifts people give me, the music I listen to. It's a great shock and a real loss for everyone who cares about modern music." Hi, Nancy. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate having you here. And I see that you've heard Louie's latest episode and are very unhappy with it. I can understand that. But that's what Christine Mitchell Driver of Main Line had to say, that he'd incorporated himself into her lifestyle, influenced the decor in her home, the gifts people gave her, and the music she listened to. Does that sound like anybody that you know? All right, now we're going to move on to the people that are in this picture. The guy with the red beard and the red hair is Andrew Gold. The guy in the middle that's wearing like the Mexican peasant shirt poncho thing is Brock Walsh. And the guy with his feet up on the control board is Greg Ladaney. And this was 1978, so it's after the period that we're talking about by just a little bit. And they're recording a song called All This in Heaven Too, or maybe a full record. Andrew had a band, Andrew Gold's band, and Brock was a musician in it. So the guy in the middle was one of the musicians, and they interviewed Brock, and his statement was, quote, "I was really destroyed by the news," end quote. So he's just a musician in the industry, not a super successful musician. He is in a band that's doing fairly well. Although I've never heard of the Andrew Gold Band. Doesn't really mean anything that I haven't heard of it. But if any of you have heard of it, I would love to hear that. And then Nancy's saying that she was at a Labor Day picnic with her cousin. Well, good for you, Nancy. It's good to get out there and celebrate the holiday. And so that was Brock Walsh. So if any of you guys know Brock, let me know. I'd never heard of him before, so I thought that was interesting to find. Elvis didn't just affect famous people or not famous people. He affected the people that were in his industry that were, seeing him as a role model and trying to improve their own lives and find their own dreams. And here we see a guy on the screen that might be familiar with a lot of you. I used to listen to him all the time. He used to have a top 40 countdown. He was also the voice of Shaggy in Scooby-Doo, the early Scooby-Doo cartoons, as well as Robin in the Super Friends cartoons, from Robin from Batman and Robin. And this is Casey Kasem. And he started out as a DJ. Was a DJ in the 50s when Elvis started. And he said, quote, "What Elvis did and the kind of music he represented served as a catalyst to everybody in our business. We tried to match the enthusiasm and image that rock and Elvis represented. Disc jockeys got away from simply reading song titles and the weather and became performers. They had to in order to match the energy of the music. Radio, after the intrusion of television, was born again with this man. When I was a jock in Detroit in 1956, we learned that to play an Elvis record at the beginning of the show would guarantee that our listeners would not tune out." So Casey's saying that Elvis didn't just change the music business as far as recording goes. He didn't just generate a bunch of fans who loved Elvis. He changed the entire radio industry. That he came along at a point when television was just entering the mainstream. People were buying televisions, and that meant that at night, television was taking over as the entertainment of choice. And prior to that, the entertainment of choice had been radio. Before that, it had been newspapers and books. People would read to each other. Once the radio came around, now somebody else could read to them. And radio was really a lot about dramatic readings back then, dramatic plays. It wasn't so much about music. It was about an audio experience of all the different genres of movies that we watch today. Right? But they would do it all on the radio with just audio. But as the television came along, that took over what the radio was doing. So the radio had to switch to mostly music. And that's how they were getting their listeners. And Casey was part of that. And he's saying that they couldn't just announce anymore. They had to adapt to the Elvis Presleys of the world, or to Elvis himself. The music was too exciting for the DJ to be bland. And so they had to become mirrors or reflections of Elvis themselves. And I think that as we see the next guy that comes up, you'll see that what Casey's saying is true, and that the DJs did become performers to the point where they modeled, they created characters for themselves to play, like would later happen with wrestling. Was already happening somewhat with wrestling at this point, but then in the 80s, when you get the guys like Hulk Hogan, that's a character that he's created that he plays. So this next picture is a guy named Wolfman Jack, and he was a DJ, and he created this character Wolfman Jack, and he would kind of scream and yell into the microphone, and he was a very, with Casey was never the excited DJ that he states in that quote. He had energy, but it was a very controlled kind of I'm your dad kind of energy. But the Wolfman Jack, I mean, he was crazy, like a wolf, right? Like a werewolf. So you never knew what Wolfman Jack might say or do on radio. Now, if you listen to him today, yeah, he would have been a very controlled and sedate kind of DJ. But compared to the people back then, he was way up there at the Dewey Phillips level, crazy. And Dewey Phillips he kind of started some of that, being one of the first guys that played Elvis. And he had a very distinct personality, which was really what drew people to his show. And Wolfman Jack kind of copied that to some extent. Now, what Wolfman Jack said was, quote, Elvis was the rock that the modern radio music industry was built on. So Wolfman Jack sees the industry that he's in, it wouldn't exist in the form that it did, and with Jack as an employee or a performer in it without Elvis. All right, now we see a guy on the screen, got a big mustache, got a giant set of headphones wrapped around his neck. This is B. Mitchell Reed. He was a disc jockey for KMET out of Los Angeles. And what he said is, quote, Elvis helped turn rhythm and blues into rock and roll. He changed the attitudes of the people who were buying records and allowed us to play what was then unusual music for the radio. Legend may not be a strong enough word for what we owe him. So B. Mitchell Reed is also agreeing that the business that he's in, being a disc jockey, he would be playing this music and he wouldn't be being a disc jockey the way he is if it hadn't been for Elvis Presley. That legend may not be a strong enough word for what we owe him. All right. Now this guy up on the screen is another disc jockey. And this is a picture from the 1950s when he started, which is when Elvis started. And his name is Art LeBeau. And he says, quote, Elvis was the most influential rock figure in history. So here's a guy that, just like Dewey Phillips, just like George Klein, who was entering the industry at this very moment, you know, he was there. Art LeBeau saw the changes that occurred within the industry after Elvis became famous. And he says he's the most influential rock figure in history. Now we got another bearded man on the screen. His name is Eddie Rabbitt. And he was a rising young country music performer. And he also wrote the song Kentucky Rain, which was Elvis's 50th gold record. And so they got a hold of him, and he gave a quote. And he had to saying, OMG Wolfman Jack. Wow, I haven't heard his name for a long time. Yep, Wolfman Jack. Can't remember exactly how he would do his thing, but this is a Wolfman Jack. But I used to listen to him too. You know, back in the 70s and throughout the 80s, DJs were still kind of a big thing. I think they've somewhat died off. They kind of went with the VJs from MTV, I think. And you don't know the names as much anymore. At least I don't. But I used to be able to tell you every DJ that was on my favorite station on a 24-hour cycle. Even though they were local DJs in the area. But I don't know. Maybe kids still do that, but I don't know. But Eddie Rabbitt here, he wrote Kentucky Rain, and he says, quote, I was in Nashville, and I had 3 songs on this tape that I was taking around to various song pluggers. Well, it turned out that one of them had arranged for Elvis to listen to my songs. And I told him, don't play him the 3rd song on the tape because I want to record it myself. Well, anyway, Elvis came in and listened to all 3. And of course, the 3rd one, which was Kentucky Rain, was the one he wanted to record. So they told me, if you keep that song for yourself, chances are it's going to go right down the toilet. But if you let a star of Presley's magnitude do it, you'll have a hit record. Well, I was pretty concerned at the time with becoming a big star and was trying to gather up enough of my own material. But they were right. So I gave my song to Elvis, and he's about the only entertainer I would do that for. So the man who wrote Kentucky Rain is saying that he really didn't want to let Elvis record it. And other people talked him into it, and he's glad now that he did. But if it had been all up to him, we would have probably never heard Elvis sing Kentucky Rain. And Nancy's saying she remembers all these guys. So I thought that was an interesting story from a man who was somewhat connected to Elvis, not directly, but he did write a song that Elvis sang, and that I think we probably all love. Now we've got an older gentleman in like a Greek fisherman's hat with a mustache on screen. This is Don Siegel. He's a director in Hollywood, and he directed the movie Flaming Star, which was one of Elvis's few movies that weren't really a music vehicle. It was a serious production. Gave him a chance at the serious acting that Elvis often claimed that he wanted to do. Wasn't as big a hit as it could have been. People give you a lot of different reasons for it. One of them could definitely have been there was an oversaturation in the market at that moment with Elvis, and there were multiple Elvis movies released by multiple studios at the same time, which was, something that you would not allow today. And that I'm not exactly sure how the Colonel lost as much control of that situation as he did to let that happen, because I think the movies competed with each other because neither of them was a music vehicle. But we can talk about that story at a later time. And I've never gone through and done the timeline myself on that one. I'm just taking what somebody else said on it, so that might be a fun one. But this guy who actually directed Flaming Star says, quote, "I remember him, not because he's dead now, but because he was such a live and vital person. But I also think he was a very sad person, a tragic figure. It was never possible to get close to him because of his entourage." Yeah, I think the most important thing that he says here is that that he thinks he was a very sad, tragic figure. And he says this is because it was not possible to get close to him because of his entourage. Well, Elvis kept that entourage specifically to keep people from becoming close to him. So, I mean, maybe that was part of it. And then he says, he was a much, much better actor than anyone was allowed to perceive. So I think that's really important. Here we have a very famous Hollywood director, someone who directed Elvis in a role of importance, a serious role. And he says Elvis was a much, much better actor than we were allowed to perceive. So he saw something in Elvis. All right, let's take a look. And now we see a guy in a blue jean jacket. And this is T.G. Sheppard, who's a country singer. And they interviewed him by phone from Nashville, Tennessee. And he says, quote, "Elvis was a very dear friend. I have just been sitting here this afternoon trying to look back on our long friendship, trying to remember a highlight, something really exciting or dramatic. And I can't remember anything except the long hours we'd spend together just sitting and jawing. And that, I think, is the most exciting thing during our 13-year friendship. Just those long talks we used to have together. I'm one guy he really touched, and I'll never forget him as long as I live. As far as all the talk about drugs is concerned, to my knowledge, he never involved himself in anything like that. If he did, it was strictly another side of him that I never saw. And even if it was true, I wouldn't want to remember him that way at all. I want to remember him as he was, a kind, gentle, and loving man. So those are some pretty nice words from T.J. Sheppard, and they seemed very raw and honest. However, they don't quite line up with things that T.G. says later. At a much later time, T.G. indicates that he was one of the very last people to see Elvis, and he has a story about stopping by on the 15th, and we haven't got there yet, so we're not going to bring it into the timeline yet. But in 1977, this is what he told the press. Now, did he tell the press, hey, I also happened to see Elvis the day before? I have to think not, because otherwise they would have put that in this article. That would have been significant to somebody. So the fact that he didn't tell that story at all, or the press cut it out, either way, is very, very odd. And it doesn't really help with the credibility of his later story. So I feel like this is much closer to the truth than what we hear from TG later. Although maybe what he says later is also the truth. I just don't know. And there's another quote from a non-famous person. This is R.J. Rob Anderson, who is the editor of the state publication for California Human Resources Director, which I don't even know what that is. It sounds like the California Human Resources Director, which would be a state-paid position, published at that time a magazine, and this guy was the editor for it, which seems like some kind of massive waste of taxpayer money. But I don't know any of that. Good time for my disclaimer that I'm just a guy that's on a microphone. I don't really know anything I'm talking about. It's an entertainment purposes only show. This isn't real news. I just show you guys stuff that I've found and think is interesting, and we all look at it together and make a decision whether we all think it's interesting. So I don't know how RJ made his money, but what he said was, quote, for more than 20 years, he was the king of rock and roll, and even though he was right on top, it is sad to realize how lonely he really was. The first record I ever bought was an Elvis Presley single, and it still gives me the chills. A 15-year-old boy just came by and remarked to me that it was a good day for it to be raining because Elvis Presley just died. And he's right. And that's a quote from R.J. Anderson. That's where we're going to stop the stories for today. I do have one more thing to give to you guys before you get out of here. But this picture that I brought up on screen, this is where we're going to be going to in our next video. This is the person that wrote the most famous newspaper obituary about Elvis, and one that many of them have been quoting from. So we're going to go back and look at that original article. We've seen pieces of it all over the place, but we haven't seen it all together as she intended it to be seen. So we probably owe it to her to take a look at that, because she also got a contract to freshen up an old Elvis Presley book and put a new front on it, a new an intro, so that they could quickly reprint it. And we covered that story in an earlier episode. But before we all say goodbye, I always mean to give you guys some links, and I always end up we run out of time or forget about it. But this is a link from August 1st, 2025, so it's fairly recent. And it's well, lost it here. It's about an Elvis Presley pop-up museum in Las Vegas, where they show you some private collection outfits and some instruments and some more private possessions or things that are linked to Elvis. And for those of you who've been watching this series, one of the items that we've talked about shows up in this clip. So watch the clip, see if you can identify the item that we've all talked about. And then you'll be able to see that the stuff that shows up in this series, even though it's from, almost 50 years ago now, still circulating out there, still being seen by people, still part of the story. And that's what I've got for you guys today. So until I see you again next time, you all keep on taking care of business.